Thank you all for joining me this evening. As you could see from the thumbnail, I wanted to continue a part at least of our discussion from Open Session 9 regarding what happens after we die. Put happens in quotation marks in that show, the prior show, Open Session 9, because happens implies you're still alive or there's something going on, right? Or nothing's happening. If nothing's happening, nothing happens after you die. You're out of existence, basically. And so many people, for example, associated with the Watchtower and other groups would say that you're alive in God's memory. You're not really alive. You're not living like we're living now in any sense other than the way God remembers you. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in relation to the text I put in the thumbnail title, because like I put quotations around happens in Open Session 9, you noticed, I'm sure, that I put a question mark after the text, 2 Corinthians 5:8, that I believe just might qualify, or maybe not, as the most misquoted Bible text when it comes to life after death, and which, whether it's a misquote or not, we're going to get to that, it's definitely, in my view, as I will explain further to you, and hopefully with you, it's definitely been the source, for reasons we're going to highlight, of confusion. It's helped confuse a view that I think if you watched Open Session 9, then you know the biblical teaching is pretty clear, right? I mean, there was no contradiction, no confusion. When we read text after text, we didn't read every text, right? We didn't read the text we're going to talk about tonight. But we read enough texts over a long period of time in several books, Old Testament and New, that basically said the same thing. That when a person dies, their body, their physical body, goes back to the dust from which Jah made it. But the spirit that Jah infused in Adam when he made him, and then also when he created Eve, that spirit returns to him. It returns to the God who gave it. And as Jesus said when he died, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. And at some point, someone give me just a brief, you're good, or the connection's good in the chat, so I know everything's going at a good quality because of the issues we had earlier. And so, based on our last show, we know overall the teaching of the Bible is clear. So how is 2 Corinthians 5:8 confusing in some way? And is that because it's a misquoted text? Are people misusing that text? Well, what does the text really say? Let's go ahead, and before we take a look at that, let's read that section of text first, because we're going to look at that section of text and then compare it with an individual many of you have heard of. And then we'll see if it's been misquoted or not, at least where it concerns that individual that I'll bring up in a moment. But first to 2 Corinthians 5:1-10. I have actually translated this section of text in the work that I'm doing at this point. I'm primarily working my way through the book of Proverbs, but I've translated a number of other texts. And so I'm working on all of them, as many as I can do effectively and credibly. I will present to you or make available, and then also, of course, defend and discuss them however I need to. But I think most of them are pretty clear. And so there are times, though, when some of them are controversial or maybe even a little bit unclear. And so we have to put them in context, both the immediate context of the text, and then we also have to look at it in terms of the larger context of thought of the document itself, the body of documents from a period of time, and then in terms of Judeo-Christianity, this involves also the Old Testament texts and many other texts, like the books of Enoch, at least if you read certain writers in the Christian texts like Jude. Okay, so let's get to 2 Corinthians 5:1-10. I'm going to read it from my translation. You can follow along with me or you can read it in your translation of texts. I believe most of it is showing up there. Looks good. So let's read this text. I've highlighted, as you can see, a couple other texts that show. We're going to read a few other scriptures, so we'll get to those in a moment. And I have some other texts that I will bring up, but those two I put there because I'm also going to, if I don't already, like I have the 1 Corinthians 15 reference that I've underlined already in the body of my working translation. But I've added the John 14, 1 through 6. And so we're going to read both of those texts and then compare sections of them. But let's take a look at 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 10. Okay, so this ties in with the open session discussion about what happens, after we die. And all those texts we read that clearly showed the body goes back to the dust, often referenced as the grave, regardless of whether you're buried in the grave or cremated or other stuff. The grave is used as a reference for the physical body's destruction. And then the spirit returns to the God who gave it. And even Jesus provided us with an example of that. And we could say that Stephen in the New Testament, in the book of Acts as well, when he saw Jesus in the heavens as he was being killed and said to receive his spirit, right? So Jesus is with the Father. He, having been resurrected, also has all authority in heaven and on earth. And so this is not a surprise at all. We'll read more, though, about certain things that happen specifically with regard to God the Father in association with Jesus because of certain spirits that return to him being Christ's bride, or figuratively referred to as that in relation to him because they're chosen from among mankind, or humankind, as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. Okay, so that'll come up a little bit later, but just as a way of kind of giving you a depiction of how certain texts have been brought up or discussed or relate to what we're going to read. Let's take that into this text. You may have your own view of those texts and ideas I referenced from the New Testament, including what happens when the Spirit returns to God, because as simple as it may seem for that to, be a teaching in the Bible, that's really where the heart of all of the dispute over what happens, if anything, after we die gets involved, because it's really not the body or the condition of the body that people often are confused about. Most people recognize the body is dead and that sleep is a metaphor that is used for the body when it's dead, even if it deteriorates. The question is, and where I believe most, if not all of the confusion around this question exists, involves what are the spirits doing when they return to God? See, so if the spirit returns to the God who gave it, that spirit is in existence. It's not non-existent. Now, some people who believe in the memory view that I referenced earlier, because the Bible does speak of remembering, us as we enter the grave, our bodies, our physical form, the thing that essentially identifies us here and that will be, in a sense, associated with our resurrection until we are given a new body. And so that reference is fine. There's no problem with it because that's how we are effectively brought back to life during the judgment, in the sense that God brings all the dead before the throne of judgment in various New Testament texts, where then they are either given eternal life or eternal destruction, which we'll talk about further in a moment. But they're either at that point clothed with a new body, or some believe you could even be clothed with the body and this is just part of your everlasting destruction. My point is that the issue often is where it's between the two bodies, okay? The question is not usually related to the physical body's condition when it's dead, but to the period after the spirit goes back to the God who gave it, and before the time that God sends it back with a new body. That's where I believe the critical confusion lies. 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 10. Verse 1, for we have learned, if ever our earthly world house of the body, or tent, should be brought down, we have a building from God, a house that is not physical, or not made with hands, which lasts forever in the heavens. Verse 2, indeed, in this body we complain about our home, as we eagerly desire to put on the body from heaven. And this ties in directly with 1 Corinthians 15, which we effectively read last week, or in our last open session, so we won't necessarily go through every verse in that section of text again, but it made it very clear that the physical body comes first, and that the grain or the seed, that thing that without a body would make us in a spiritual sense naked, and that without the physical body or the spiritual body is just a grain, right, a seed, but then it's given a body, right? So there's a physical body that's sown from the physical seed, and there's a spiritual body that's sown from a spiritual seed that God sends forth. The Spirit, I'm going to argue from the text, that returns to him after a person dies. But I believe, as I'm going to show you, that the spirit that returns to the God who gave it is asleep. And while that is alive, they're effectively not conscious of anything at all. Are you conscious of anything when you're asleep? Let's just use that, since the metaphor for death in this sense is sleep, and I intend to show that not only the body, but the spirits with God prior to being resurrected in their spiritual body are asleep. They're not conscious. Just like when we're asleep, we're alive, but we're not consciously acting and moving around and doing things with deliberate thought. We have random thoughts and things that take on at times in our mind while we're asleep, but we're not really directing a whole flow of living that we do when we're awake, right? It's just these random thoughts. Our body's not really moving the way our mind is thinking it's moving when we're asleep. We can show that. We know that. So if that's the metaphor for the body and the spirit prior to receiving the spiritual body after a person dies, then I would argue that's exactly what Ecclesiastes 9:5 teaches as well. They're not conscious of anything. They're not doing anything. They're asleep. Just like you're not conscious really of anything that you're doing or can do, and or doing anything when you're asleep. But you are, in the spiritual sense, according to the text we're going to read, with God, with the God who gave it, until, as the text we read last, in our last open session, stated clearly as well, until that God sends it back again, in which case they are created. All right, so we'll pick up right there. For we have a verse 1, we'll go to verse 1 again. We have a building from God, a house that is not physical, which lasts forever in the heavens. Indeed, in this body we complain. Okay, we read that. Verse 3, and in fact, if we are unclothed, we will not be found naked. Okay, that's because in this body we complain about our home as we eagerly desire to put on the body from heaven, and so in fact, if we're unclothed, not be found naked. We'll get to that further in a moment, but this ties in my view, with the seed that is referred to by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, verse 4, for those who live in the body complain as we are heavily burdened over what we do not want, namely to be unclothed. So what does that mean? Without a body, right? When a person dies, as we read in all those texts, and even when Jesus died, he himself said his body went into the tomb, right? His physical body was there for 3 days, in our view, and then, but the spirit was entrusted to the Father. It returned to the God who gave it, until he clothed that spirit with a new body. And it says that our spiritual body will be fashioned according to his. And his, you can read about in descriptive terms in texts like Revelation 1 and 2, which are very similar to the descriptions of the spiritual beings as I've discussed previously in books like Daniel and elsewhere. Okay, for those who live in the body complain, okay, as we are heavily burdened over what we do not want, namely to be unclothed, right? We want a body. Instead, we want to be clothed, so that which is subject to death might be overwhelmed by life. But God is the one preparing you for this very thing, the one giving you the guarantee of the Spirit. Therefore, we are always confident. Also, we have learned that while we are here now in the body, we're away from the Lord. In other words, we're not in there, we're not with them actually. Right? Remember what Jesus said, we're with him where two or more are gathered in a spiritual sense, but that's not what he's talking about. Verse 7, yet we live our lives by faith, not simply by sight. Okay, verse 8. Main text in terms of what we're really focused on as to whether it's the most misquoted Bible text regarding life after death. And if not, what does it teach? Why is there a problem? Verse 8, so while we are confident, we are also more interested in being away from the body or this body and being present, which is a form of the Greek verb endemeo, and being present with the Lord. We want to be away from this physical body and in a real spirit sense be with the Lord in heaven. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about, the with me in the two or more sense. Verse 9, for this reason, we know that because Jesus did say he'd be with us when two or more are gathered in his name, right? So that's a different sense. Verse 9, for this reason, too, we have a clear intent, namely, whether we are here in this body or away from it to be pleasing to him. And then it says, verse 10, indeed, we must all appear before the court of Christ so he may give back to each one according to the things done through this body. So what's he talking about here? We must all appear before the court of Christ. Well, that's the final judgment. So he may give back to each one according to the things done. Face to face with what each person chose to do in order to determine whether they were good or evil. That's exactly what Jesus says in John 5 and what we read about in Revelation 20, the white throne judgment. Everyone appears and they're rewarded according to their deeds. So that's the same period of time as we're going to read about later in 1 Thessalonians 4, 14 through 17 that Paul's talking about, right? The last trumpet, when those who they're sleeping, as we're going to read, God brings those with him. It says God brings those with him, and Jesus descends with an archangel's voice to raise their physical form in relation to their spiritual body, right? The references to what died in the physical sense being made incorruptible. The corruptible puts on incorruption, right? What's mortal puts on immortality, 1 Corinthians 15. That's the reference to the body. But it before that says that God is bringing with him those who have fallen asleep. Well, what's with God? Not the physical dead body. The spirit. It said that explicitly over and over again, right? In our open session 9, the spirit returns to the God who gave it. That's whom Jah is bringing with him. We'll get to that text in a moment. But let's look closer at this 2 Corinthians 5:8. Okay, so let me bring up another item here for us. I'll get it for you in just a moment. I'm going to show a text. Now, many of you have heard of Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible answer man. He took over for Dr. Walter Martin at the Christian Research Institute, a place that is known in those who worship Jah circles as, an apologetic nut group that for decades has misstated numerous biblical texts, numerous biblical beliefs, and attacked pretty much everybody. And I'm not saying everyone they've attacked has been undeserving. It's just their whole ministry is basically, apologetic emphasis and deconstructing whomever they don't like or agree with. And of course, now you have Hank Hanegraaff, from what I understand, converting to Eastern Orthodox. So, now all of his apologetic nut friends can have fun with him. But I'm not really focused on that right here. I'm just giving you some context on who Hank Hanegraaff is. We hear him all the time in California and across the nation because he has a popular broadcast, the Bible Answer Man. And he has for many years, CRI, Christian Research Institute. But in any case, as I said, they often make mistakes. And I'm happy to discuss them if anyone would like to. And so, but that's not my purpose, right? I'm not here to discuss mistakes or get into people. It's just that Hank Hanegraaff is very influential, right? He's had a daily broadcast, I believe, for many years, and has written many books. He took over for Walter Martin. So many churches and religious organizations are familiar with the Christian Research Institute and Hank Hanegraaff. He's not unknown by far. So, when he says something over and over again, as he does in relation to 2 Corinthians 5, we'll get a little more light in here, then we should take note. And so what I want to show is that, in fact, I do believe Hank Hanegraaff is one of many who have, in one sense, misquoted this text. But, I don't think he, in the deepest sense, is. And is there is really the operative term, right? For many people, they would come right out and say it's a misquotation. If you were to say, for example, 2 Corinthians 5:8 teaches that when you're absent from the body, the misquotation, quote unquote, is that instead of saying we want to be away from this body and present with the Lord, Hank Hanegraaff numerous times on his show has said, I've heard it myself. I've listened to it often. I don't listen to it regularly, but I've heard it so many times in the past that, you could search most of his shows, and we're going to listen to a couple here just briefly in a moment, at least parts of them, and find him quoting this text and stating it in terms of being absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's the misquotation. So what's happening there is that the text, as we just read it, doesn't say is, right? Or at least not in my translation. I think you'll find in most translations too that that's not what's happening. And so, or at least that's not how they word it. Now the question then is, well, what is the significance between is and is it such that it is truly a misquotation to say is and not and? It is because, well, in the way Hank Hanegraaff means it, as you're going to see, he means that, essentially, when you're absent from the body, you are present with the Lord in the sense of being, conscious. You're aware. So unlike, for example, unlike Ecclesiastes 9, which says you're not conscious of anything, and in the context says you don't do this, you don't do that, things normally conscious people would do. And so Hank would disagree with that and say, no, you are conscious, you are aware, you're actually in the presence of God in Abraham's bosom. And often Luke 16, we'll read some texts involving Lazarus, but not Luke 16. I've talked about it before, link in the description below. And we're going to do a whole show on that separately, so I'll set that aside for now. But just know that what they believe, people like Hank Hanegraaff and others, is that when the spirit goes back to God, it's actually aware, conscious, not sleeping in the sense of like we would here and be unconscious, unaware, effectively not doing or knowing anything, but alive. Well, they would believe, no, you're definitely aware, and you are aware of what's happening even on earth. At least Hank would say that. And most, I think, like him would say that you're alive and conscious in heaven. Okay, I would say no. No, you're sleeping with God. Just like all of those texts say, the Spirit returns to him and they're recreated. They're created when he sends his Spirit forth to give them a new body. That's the creation. The Spirit's still alive and existing and sleeping with him. Effectively, not conscious or doing anything. Exactly like Ecclesiastes 9:5 says. So, there's no contradiction in that sense, whereas there is, in my view, with them. Right? They believe that that's contradicted or at least changed at some point, or they just don't interpret Ecclesiastes 9:5 that way. Many don't. So let's see what Hank has to say in terms of quoting this text. We'll go to, let me bring up the split screen here, make sure you guys can see it. I'll put links below so you can check this out, but we'll go to minute 1:30, or minute 1 and second 30, about right here. Let's take a listen to part of this. Let me pause that and just make sure. Let me get the sound activated here. Okay, let's listen to Hank for a moment. Okay, so you heard that. Let me just back that up a moment. Let me see if I can increase that a little bit. Okay, so listen carefully. What does he say?
Life after life, because we'd be absent from the body, present with the Lord. And that...
Okay, now notice there, he didn't say is or and. He just said absent from the body, present with the Lord. Now you're going to see that by that he essentially means is. Or he definitely is okay with referring to this verse, and often does. I've heard him many times. And you're going to see he's okay with it explicitly. As to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Now, the text actually uses the word kai, the Greek word kai, which is often translated and, but not exclusively. In fact, in the New Testament writings, kai is used more frequently by comparison, I would say, than most other Greek literature. And it doesn't always mean and. But it often does. It certainly doesn't have the same meaning as is usually, although let me explain. So there is one sense in which I would say you could I still don't think is the right word under any circumstance, but what I'm getting at is there is a use of kai that is known as explicative. There's also an adverbial sense, even. I don't think that really fits here. Absent from the body, even to be present with the Lord. Not in the same sense that is does. See, I don't really see a difference at all in any of this. And I'll tell you why in a moment. That's why I want you to stick with me here. I'm not so sure I would say absent from the body is to be present with the Lord is a misquotation, in the sense that that meaning couldn't be found to be consistent with this text. And I'll explain that in a moment. I kind of did already. But I want to explain what I mean by misquotation, and not because in the sense that Hank uses it or means it, doesn't use and, uses is or just neither one. He means you immediately are with the Lord or with God in a conscious sense, right? Not just sleeping. He doesn't believe in soul sleep, like your spirit goes to be with God, like I described earlier. He sleeps with him until he brings you with him at the time when he prepares a body for you. And then everyone is gathered together, as Paul says. We'll read that further in a moment in 1 Thessalonians 4. But you heard just there. So let's take a look now at another clip from Hank where there's a caller, and it's a young girl. I'll bring this up real briefly here. It's a young girl, and she quotes the text perfectly. But then Hank started talking after that, and, okay, so let's just take a look. Let's listen in.
And present with the Lord.
Let me get back a little bit further. And I'm sure Hank's a nice guy in many other ways, right? I'm not trying to condemn Hank or make him out to be a bad person. He just has an adversarial stance against many beliefs I hold dear, such as Jesus being an actual son of God, meaning a God, like he taught in relation to Psalm 82. The same thing his father said, that the sons of God were gods, that he used in his own defense. So we have some differences there, for sure. But let's listen in here on this subject.
He is absent from the body
and present with the Lord, right? She's asking this question. She wants to know more about this text that we're discussing here. So Hank listens, and there's something very interesting that Hank does that I actually think is a great analogy. We'll get to that in a moment. Not in the way he intends, though. This is the two sections that I wanted to share with you that involve him saying absent from the body but present with the Lord, and then where he doesn't use but and or is, and then uses an analogy I think you'll find very effective if you believe like me. Okay, so around minute 1, right here.
And so she's experiencing God, but she's also experienced other loved ones who have died. So together, she's now absent from the body, but she's present with the Lord.
Did you hear that? Okay, absent from the body, but present with the Lord.
Let me say this, that she is now absent from the body, but she's present with the Lord.
But she's present with the Lord. Okay, so he's the two quotes we've heard from him, and again, I don't think you'd find it hard to find him saying is. Many people say it, and he said it, I've heard him. But the two quotes we've shown already at least show he says absent from the body, present with the Lord, or absent from the body, but she's present with the Lord. So let's move forward now a little bit to this analogy I was referring to. And where he quotes it again, he doesn't use but this time, though.
From the body, present with.
Okay, I was right at it. Listen carefully.
Whereas Paul makes plain they're absent from the body, present with the Lord.
Okay, so no and, is, or but. And now he's going to go on to give an analogy. In fact, so I don't run into issues with showing his videos too much, I'll put the link in the description below, right at this mark, right around the 2-minute mark. He goes on to give an analogy about a caterpillar and how that caterpillar transforms into a butterfly and becomes like a whole new thing, right? It has different sensations and abilities to process color, and of course looks totally different, right? So even though it's a physical thing, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul contrasts the physical with the spiritual, we get that with the butterfly analogy, what he was trying to say, at least in that point, is the difference in the body, right? It goes through a whole change. But what he doesn't discuss, and you can read this, you can watch this on your own, is the cocoon period. He doesn't explain in his analogy what's the cocoon period. The cocoon period is being with God after you die, sleeping, not doing or knowing anything at all, but alive to him, exactly like Jesus said. He's the God not of the dead, but of the living. Why? They're all living to him, not to everybody else. They're sleeping with him. Okay, so, and in that light, let me go ahead and see. Okay, so let me wrap this up with Hank real quickly in terms of his, teaching over many years about, or referencing this text, 2 Corinthians 5:8. Let's go to one last video clip where this caller calls in and misquotes the text. If you see is as a misquotation, right? It doesn't say and, but I believe you could say it's explicative, which I'll get to further in a moment. Meaning that by explicative, well, I'll just cover it now. Explicative is a way you could use and to say basically what follows, what precedes and is being explained. Explicative, explained further by what follows and. And so as a reference, I'll give everybody, and we'll just make this quick so we can get to the text and to this last video involving Hank, is the Bauer, Gingrich, and Danker Lexicon, the 3rd edition, page 495, under Chi, far right column, under the circled C, kind of like the copyright symbol. It says, often explicative, i.e. a word or clause is connected by means of Chi with another word or clause for the purpose of explaining what goes before it. And so it would translate something like, and so, that is, namely. I would say this is the best way. If you wanted to justify being immediately with God and the sense being intended by 2 Corinthians 5:8, if that's what you believe, that it's immediate. And I believe it is too, just that it's the Spirit that goes to be present with the Lord or with God. They're both there and involved to some extent, as you'll see if you read the texts. Although there's specific roles assigned to each in relation to the marriage of the Lamb. And so, in either case, back to this. So, I would say that the explicative defense for Chi is really the best way to go if you wanted to say that after you leave this body, you basically immediately go to be with the Lord. But I would say that's exactly what texts like in Psalms that we read in Open Session 9, and when Jesus was dying and said, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit, according to Luke, that's exactly what they're saying. It's the same thing. It doesn't say in 2 Corinthians 5:8 that you're going to be conscious with the Lord. If you're sleeping with God, even in what I would call the illustration of Lazarus and Abraham in Luke 16, we're going to do a whole show about that next week. I would say even that shows figuratively that you have people resting with God, right, if that's how you see Abraham. Because in John 11, Jesus says explicitly, and the text states, that Lazarus fell asleep. So where did his spirit go? Well, according to all the texts that we read in Open Session 9, it goes back to the God who gave it. So when Jesus arrived and raised Lazarus from the dead, it wasn't just his body. He had to bring his spirit back. But his spirit wasn't conscious. He didn't relate things going on with God that would be really inconsistent with having to bring him back, right? If he's really existing with God in that kind of paradise place in a real sense, like Luke 16 figuratively describes in my view, then it wouldn't really be such a sad occasion in ways that would require Jesus to bring his spirit back in order to assuage the fears and and their concerns and weeping and his own, right? Because of how much he cared about them, or Lazarus. So Lazarus doesn't say anything about what was happening with God in that way. He was asleep, both in terms of the body and the spirit. Because Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4 that those sleeping God will bring with him. We're going to get to that in a moment. He's not bringing the physical bodies with him. He's bringing what's with him, right? Where did the bodies go back? Where did they go back? To the dust, the grave. The spirit is not in the grave. The spirit is with the God who gave it. So that's what God is bringing with him, according to 1 Thessalonians 4:14 through 17. We'll get to that in a moment. All right, so let's go to this video. It's another Hank Hanegraaff video from June 7, 2012. I mean, again, he's been on the air for a long time and written many things, so it wouldn't be difficult to find. In fact, if you look here in the description, you can see that part of the content, can you explain to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? And you can see it's in quotations, right? And that is what the caller questions Hank about. Let's take a look. But it's very important because you'll see that Hank basically equates the descriptive reference to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, which he himself has said many times, with whether he uses it or not. He sees them as the same thing, and certainly sanctions the use of is here, which again, I don't necessarily see as ultimately problematic from a translation standpoint. I wouldn't use is. I would say which means, if I was going to be or and so, like we read in the Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker lexicon that I referenced a moment ago. So I wouldn't use is, but I would use what would be appropriate in an explicative sense for and. But I think you could get is in there somehow and have it mean basically the same thing. So in translation, we have to be careful that I wouldn't use that. I think it's incorrect and confuses people. But what's really a concern to me is that Hank believes you're actually conscious when you're present with the Lord. And that's not what this text in 2 Corinthians 5:8 is teaching. It's teaching exactly what every other text teaches, that the body returns to the ground, the spirit returns to the God who gave it, and that we're sleeping with him until the number of all of our other brothers and sisters is filled, exactly like it states in Revelation 6, which is consistent with Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, right? Those sleeping, God will bring with him, the Lord will descend, and everyone will be transformed, given a new body at the same time. That's it. But the problem is people think everyone's consciously alive, in contradiction to Ecclesiastes 9 and other texts that state you're not conscious of anything. You don't have any thoughts. You're not doing anything. You're effectively asleep, just like Lazarus was before Jesus raised him, and just like you basically are, although physically alive. You're not doing anything when you're asleep today. You're not conscious of anything, even though you're physically alive in the sense that we're using by analogy here. All right, let's listen to this video real quickly. So let's go to 12:05. And we'll get the right part.
Present in heaven, soul sleep, what
Testament.
Okay, this is the caller.
that passed away just lately.
I don't want to get all the material, but I'll clip out some stuff.
He was a believer. Where did he go? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
Okay, so the caller right there just quoted 2 Corinthians 5:8 and said, he's talking about his loved one who passed on, wants more information from Hank. We get it. It's something people want to know about. That's why Paul wrote what he wrote, right? He said, we don't want you to have no hope. The caller, in one sense, misquoted the text, right? That's why I say, is it the most misquoted? I don't think so when you get right down to it, what it ultimately can mean. Like I said, in the explicative sense, it would ultimately be consistent with, I think, with is. There's still something wrong there, and it's not quite the same. And certainly in the sense of being conscious with God, which contradicts the other text, is incorrect. And so with that meaning, certainly it's a misquotation, and not only potentially in terms of translation, but certainly where it concerns what is meant. So we heard the caller say that. Now listen to what Hank says a few seconds later, right here. He has the opportunity, right, to say, okay, well, I know what you mean by that, and I think we really agree right? He thinks we're consciously alive after we die, but the text really says, and to be present with the Lord. Unless he's going to explain like I did, right, that it's used in an explicative sense. Well, let's hear what Hank says. After the caller quoted that text, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
It's a relational term. And you correctly identified that by saying absent from the body, present with the Lord.
Okay, so you see how he basically says that when he quotes the text as absent from the body, present with the Lord, doesn't use and, doesn't use is, and doesn't use but like he did once before, which we showed. He means the same thing as what the caller says. The absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So he certainly sanctioned that reference of the text. And so the only way I believe that would be okay would be if, unlike Hank and his caller, unfortunately, or who knows, but it didn't seem like it, that you're not conscious of anything at all, just like the other texts say. You're sleeping. You're with God. Yes, you're alive. You're not non-existent. You non-existent people, or you memory-only people, where it concerns the spirit, you're not consistent with the text that Jesus, which shows Jesus said he's the God of the living, not the dead. They're all living to him, and that the spirit returns to the God who gave it. It doesn't say the spirit goes to the grave or in the dust. It's with God. What does 1 Thessalonians 4 say? Let's go to that now. I'll go ahead and bring that text up. I'm going to use the New World Translation for that one because I haven't translated it yet. And so, let me go ahead and do that for a moment. Get that going here. Oh, I'll just go ahead and keep that up. So we'll go up there. You can follow with me. 1 Thessalonians 4. So, who is God going to bring with him? 1 Thessalonians 4, 14 through 17. We're going to read this, Revelation 6, and then we're going to wrap it up. I can't see your questions if you have them, because even though I'm able to do the live stream, I certainly have this recorded. For whatever reasons, the chat is locked up. So I had some problems earlier, but I think I got the live stream going. And either way, I recorded this. So let's get to 1 Thessalonians 4. That's 1 Timothy. So who are the ones God's bringing with him? Who's with him? The physical deteriorating body's not with him. People aren't given a new body until the last trumpet. 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 right here. 4:14. For if our faith is that Jesus died and rose again, so too those who have fallen asleep through Jesus, God will bring with him. Focus on this. Those who have fallen asleep, it says in death in brackets, that's what it means, right? But some would say that's the death of the body, if you mean not conscious. But it says through Jesus, God will bring with him. They've fallen asleep through Jesus, right? The witnessing work they had, and that's why they're below the altar. They gave their life in service to God and the Christ. We'll read that in a moment, Revelation 6. So they fell asleep in death through Jesus. Those ones, the ones who fell asleep in death through Jesus, God's going to bring those with him. Where is he going to bring them with him? This is what we tell you by Jehovah's Word says. I'm not going to get into the divine name issue here. We, the living, who survive to the presence of the Lord, shall in no way go before those who have fallen asleep. Go where? Because the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a commanding call, with an archangel's voice, and with God's trumpet. The last trumpet, the same trumpet Paul referred to in 1 Corinthians 15. And those who are dead in union with Christ will rise first. So whom is God bringing with him if right here it states explicitly that only at the sounding of the last trumpet and the descending of Christ with the archangel's voice are the dead, right? Resurrected. This is the bodying. Almost everyone agrees this is the point where the people are given a new body. Okay, well, who is God bringing with him? He's bringing the spirits of those who are going to receive this body, who have fallen asleep in death, who are with him. They're with him because they're asleep in death. The spirit returned to the God who gave it. He's not bringing their dead corpses along. they'll figuratively come up out of the grave, or literally, if that's how they want to do it, in a sense that those people may actually still be there, and the overwhelming power of Jah, a la Lazarus, John chapter 11, where people are certainly going to come back to life to be judged, but it says the sea gave up those dead in them. It doesn't just say out of the grave. So, and people have died in many ways. The point is that this is the resurrection, where people are clothed with a body. Prior to that, they're with God because they're asleep with him. And so now let's go to Revelation 6 real briefly. So you have this right here. Notice this. It says, those who have fallen asleep through Jesus, God will bring with him to the resurrection. Revelation 6. And we're going to end with this. And then I'll summarize the 2 Corinthians 5:8 misquotation issues again. Revelation 6, 9 through 11. And when he opened the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those slaughtered because of the word of God and because of the witness work they used to have. Those who have fallen asleep through Jesus in death. Right now, they're under the altar here because of the word of God, because of this work. The altar is depicting their sacrifice, right? What do you do on an altar? You sacrifice. It's depicting the sacrifice they gave their life to God for. But even the Luke 16 literal people would say they're not actually at the altar, right? Because they're in Abraham's bosom, according to those people. Unless they're going to change the point at which this text is referring to the people who are asleep with God. Or even with God if they don't see the spirits as asleep. The point is, clearly from 1 Thessalonians 4, they are asleep. Those are the ones God's bringing with him who have fallen asleep in death, who are going to be resurrected to a new body. But they're with God. They're the spirits with God. And so here they're depicted in heaven with God under the altar because of their sacrifice. Verse 10, they, right, the souls who were slaughtered, they're dead. This is not referencing their actual body. It's their souls in heaven under the altar. Until when? This is what their souls cry out, either literally or figuratively, a la Abel's blood, which is said to have cried out to Jah. And even at that point, of course, his spirit would be with Jah, resting with him. And in that sense, Jah would be aware. And so the blood would cry out because of the death that occurred. And this is not hard to put together, especially with all the other texts. But then it says that these spirits, either literally or figuratively, because they're resting with God, right? They're not non-existent. They're alive. But their death and the fact that they were slaughtered for the word of God and for the Christ cries out to Jah. Just like the way Abel, who was sacrificing rightly to Jah when he died, cried out to Jah, figuratively. But even if literally, my point is they're with Jah and they're sleeping. And even here, look what it says. First they say, until when, sovereign Lord, holy and true, are you refraining from judging and avenging our blood upon those who dwell on the earth? Verse 11, and a white robe was given to each of them. And they were told to rest a little while longer. Rest. Okay? If you're resting, you're not doing anything. Even if you want to say rest, and we're not saying non-existent, not alive. Your spirit is alive with God, but you're not doing anything. Right here, they're crying out because they're having to rest. They're under the altar. They've been killed. They're the ones God's going to bring with him. 1 Thessalonians 4, 14, 15 through 17. They're then resurrected to a new body. So, of course, they're alive, but they're not doing anything. They're asleep. Even here, they're told to rest until the what? The number of their fellow brothers or slaves are killed, as they also had been. It says to rest a little while longer, right? So what they were doing before they cried out and said, when are you going to avenge us? Was rest. They were sleeping. But the length of their sleep and the fact that they gave their life in sacrifice to God, hence under the altar, cried out to Jah for vengeance. But then they were given this robe, which is either a representation for being patient and waiting. It says told to rest until the number of their fellow slaves are sealed. What does Paul say? We don't go before those who have fallen asleep in death. Right? What does it say? It's almost like they're trying, they want to go. Jah's saying, no, you wait. Because I'm going to keep testing all of these ones until they're all filled. Paul made that same point. We're going to keep going all the way to the end and be caught up. Even the ones who are alive, The ones who don't die, but they'll be transformed and so effectively killed by Jehovah or Jesus into that new life. But they're never really dead in the sense that their spirit stays alive. But the spirit is asleep. It's not doing anything. It's not conscious. It's asleep. And so it says, keep sleeping, basically. Or even if you say rest, I'm going to argue that it's consistent with 1 Thessalonians 4 that they're asleep. That's what it's talking about. But they're speaking, you see? They're viewed as alive in relation to God, because what did Jesus say? They're all living to Him. Not to you and me or everybody else. Who are they talking to here? Him. They're living with God. They're spirits with God. They're asleep with God. Even in the Luke 16, Lazarus is where? He's in the bosom of Abraham, resting, figuratively. But what was he doing before Jesus resurrected him? Sleeping with God, literally. The Abraham of that illustration, as I'm going to show in my next stream on these texts. We'll do a whole show on Luke 16. But I wanted to discuss 2 Corinthians 5:8 and to show clearly that, we need to be careful whether we put this in the context of of misquotations. Yes, I think technically it's a misquotation to say absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, because the text doesn't use a verb, and it could have easily done so. But the text does use kai, which can have an explicative and an adverbial sense, both of which may in some way be consistent with what I think people like Hank mean when they effectively misquote this text. So I wouldn't make so much about the misquotation. Make a lot about the information, right? Focus on what it says, what it means, what everything together clearly teaches. And it's not that people are conscious and totally aware and alert of everything happening everywhere. That's not how they're described. Not even when they're, in my view, figuratively presented as actually speaking, like in Revelation 6. They're told to keep resting, so they're not doing anything. Not in the sense that we might think of them as doing things or being consciously aware of what happens on earth in those ways. That's not how the text presents them. So I would caution you to keep your perspective. Think of people who have died as alive to Jah. Where better else for them to be, right? The one who He's going to bring them with Him when those who are faithful to Him through their witness work to His Son and to all the things He did are made alive together with them in a new body.